Out here, where the land is carved by the wind and the sky is a canvas of unforgiving blue, a man is measured by two things: the speed of his draw and the weight of his choices. The West doesn't build character, it reveals it, stripping a man down to the bone of who he truly is. Some find law, some find freedom in chaos, and some find themselves staring across a pistol barrel at the only family they've ever known. The dust of Dry Creek was a fine, reddish powder that settled on everything. A constant reminder that the untamed plains were always waiting to reclaim what little civilization had been scratched into their surface. From the boardwalk in front of his office, Sheriff Cole McGraw watched the sun begin its slow descent toward the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The light softened, painting the long Main Street in hues of gold and amber. It was the peaceful hour, the time when the clang of the blacksmith's hammer gave way to the murmur of conversation from the saloon and the scent of wood smoke from kitchen stoves. Cole breathed it in. This peace was his life's work. It was a fragile thing, built not with force, but with a quiet and yielding resolve that the townsfolk had come to depend on. His badge, a simple silver star, felt heavier some days than others. Today, it felt like an anchor, holding the town steady in a world that was anything but. He was a tall man, lean and weathered like the high country pines. His face, sharp-featured and sun-browned, was a near-perfect mirror of his brother's, yet the landscape of his expression was entirely different. Where Luke's eyes held a restless, stormy fire, Cole's were the calm, steady blue of a winter sky. They were eyes that saw everything and betrayed little. "Evenin', Sheriff." The voice belonged to old Jebediah Stone, his deputy, who was leaning back in a chair against the office wall, whittling a piece of wood. Jeb was 20 years Cole's senior, with a face like a wrinkled road map and a disposition that hovered somewhere between cynical and philosophical. "Jeb," Cole nodded, his gaze sweeping the street one last time before turning to the man. "Quiet day." "The quiet ones are the ones that worry me," Jeb grunted, not looking up from his work. "It's like the world's taken a deep breath before it decides to start screaming again." As if on cue, the sound of a horse being ridden hard reached them from the east road. It wasn't the hurried but steady gallop of a rancher, it was the frantic, desperate pace of a man running from a ghost. A moment later, a lone rider thundered into town, pulling his lathered horse to a skidding halt. He was the driver from the Blackwood stage line, his face pale with dust and terror. "Sheriff," he gasped, half falling from the saddle. "They hit us. About 10 miles east of the fork. They came out of nowhere." Cole was already moving, his calm demeanor hardening into sharp focus. "Who hit you? How many?" "5 of them." "Masked," the driver stammered, taking a canteen Jeb offered him. "But they weren't just robbers, Sheriff. They were organized. Like soldiers. They knew exactly when we'd be in that ravine. Took the payroll box. Didn't even bother with the passengers' trinkets. One of the guards tried to be a hero. They shot him down without a word. Just cold." Cole's jaw tightened. It was the third such robbery in 2 months, each one creeping closer to his jurisdiction. Each one carried out with the same brutal efficiency. "There's something else," the driver said, his voice dropping. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely tied piece of leather cord. "They tied up the other guard with this. The knot, never seen one like it." Cole took the leather cord. His fingers, rough and calloused, traced the intricate loops. It was a double figure-8 bend, reinforced with a half-hitch. A sailor's knot. And not their father, a man who had worked the river barges before heading west, had taught them as boys. It was a knot he and Luke had used 100 times to tie down gear, to fix a harness, to secure their world. No one else used it. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, settled in his gut. "I'm riding out," Cole said, his voice flat. He turned to Jeb. "Get Doc Adams. Tell him to meet me at the stage. You hold down the town." Jeb saw the look on Cole's face and the way his hand rested on the leather cord. He stopped whittling and stood up, his folksy demeanor gone. "Cole, is it him?" Cole didn't answer. He didn't have to. The ride out was silent and grim. The sun was gone, leaving a bruised purple sky behind. By the time he reached the stagecoach, it was sitting in the middle of the road like a wounded animal, its door agape. The passengers were huddled together, and Doc Adams was already tending to the dead guard. Cole ignored them all at first. His lawman's eyes took in the scene, reading the story in the dirt. 5 horses, waiting patiently behind a rock formation. No wasted movements. They had come, taken what they wanted, and vanished. He knelt by the tracks. They were heading south, toward the Badlands, toward lawless territory. He walked to where the other guard sat, his hands still raw from the bonds. Cole looked at the man's wrists, then back at the knot in his own hand. It was the same. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of memory, so vivid it was almost dizzying. He was 12 years old again, huddled with Luke under a leaky canvas tarp during a thunderstorm. They were skinny, hungry boys, their knuckles bruised from a fight over a stolen loaf of bread. "You tie it like this, Cole," Luke had said, his fingers deftly weaving a piece of twine. "See? 2 loops, through and back." Pa said it'll never slip. Said it's a McGraw knot. "It's ours." "Ours," Cole had repeated, his shoulder pressed against his twin's for warmth. Against the thunder, against the hunger, against the world, they were one. The McGraw brothers. The memory faded, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. That bond, that promise, where had it gone? It had frayed over the years, strained by Luke's growing anger at a world he saw as tilted against them, and Cole's stubborn belief that a man could still walk a straight line, no matter how crooked the path. The final break had come 5 years ago, after an argument that had turned to fists, ending with Luke riding out of Dry Creek with a curse on his lips and a storm in his eyes. Cole hadn't seen him since, but he'd heard the whispers. Whispers of a ruthless outlaw named McGraw leading a gang called the Red Dust Riders, building a reputation for daring raids and cold-blooded violence. He had allowed himself to believe they were just stories. He had hoped they were about some other McGraw. His search of the area was methodical. He looked for a dropped shell casing, a forgotten spur, anything. As twilight deepened into true dark, the glint of his lantern caught something on the ground, half hidden under a sagebrush, near where the outlaws had mounted their horses. It wasn't a clue. It was a confession. He picked it up. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb. The wings were swept back, the wood worn smooth with time. Cole's breath caught in his chest. He had carved this bird 30 years ago, on a cold winter's night, and given it to Luke for his 8th birthday. It was the only gift he'd had to give. Luke had carried it ever since, a good luck charm against the world. Leaving it here was no accident. It was a message. It was Luke, his own flesh and blood, announcing his arrival. The shadow on the horizon had a name, and it was his own. Cole closed his fist around the small bird, the worn wood pressing into his palm. The peace of Dry Creek was over. The world was about to start screaming again. And the storm that was coming wore his brother's face. The small, carved bird felt like a brand in Cole's palm. For 2 days after the stagecoach robbery, he kept his discovery to himself. The town was on edge, but the threat was still distant, a story from 10 miles down the road. Cole, however, felt its presence like a change in the barometric pressure before a storm. Luke was no longer a ghost from his past or a whisper from another territory. He was here. He had drawn a line in the sand, and Dry Creek was on the other side. The confirmation came on the 3rd morning, painted in smoke against the clear blue sky. A thick, black plume rose from the west, in the direction of the Abernathy Ranch, the largest cattle operation in the county. Cole's heart sank. This wasn't a raid for gold. This was a message. He and Jebediah rode out immediately, the grim silence between them heavier than any words. The smell of burning hay and charred wood reached them long before they saw the devastation. The main barn of the Abernathy homestead was a blackened, skeletal ruin, its frame smoldering against the sky. Distressed cattle lowed nervously in their pens, and ranch hands rushed about with buckets, dousing the last of the embers. John Abernathy, a man as tough and weathered as the land he worked, met them at the gate. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and fear. "They came just after dawn, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl. 10 of them. The Red Dust Riders. They didn't even try to hide who they were. "Did they take anything?" Cole asked, his gaze fixed on the ruined barn. 200 head of my best steer," Abernathy spat. "But that wasn't the point. They wanted us to watch. They moved like they were herding sheep, not rustling cattle. Professional." Then their leader, he paused, his eyes finding Cole's. "He looks like you, Sheriff." "Lord help me, he looks just like you. He's the one who threw the lantern into the barn." He just smiled while it burned. The words struck Cole like a physical blow. He could picture it perfectly. Luke, astride his horse, the firelight dancing in his restless eyes, that familiar, reckless smile on his face. It was the smile he'd worn before jumping from a cliff into the creek, the smile he'd had before picking a fight with 3 miners twice his size. It was a smile that courted destruction. "They said to tell you the garden was getting crowded," Abernathy finished. "Said it was time for some weeding." Cole spent the next hour examining tracks and talking to the ranch hands. The story was the same. The riders were disciplined, silent, and followed the orders of one man. A man with Cole McGraw's face. The fear they had instilled was more damaging than the loss of the cattle. If the Abernathy Ranch, with its 24 hired guns, wasn't safe, then no one was. He rode back to town with a storm brewing inside him. The weight of the badge felt immense, a shield that was proving too small to protect the people he had sworn to serve. He passed the schoolhouse as children were being let out for the day. Their laughter felt like a sound from another world. Sarah Carter stood on the porch, ringing a small handbell. She had grown up with the McGraw brothers, a bright, steady presence in the chaos of their youth. She had been the one to bandage their scraped knees, to share her lunch when they had none. Her hair was the color of wheat, and her eyes held a kindness that Cole had often felt he didn't deserve. He saw her look up, her smile fading as she saw the grim set of his jaw. He dismounted and walked towards her, hat in hand. "Cole," she said, her voice soft with concern. "We saw the smoke. Is it true what they're saying, that it was Luke?" Cole could only nod. "He calls his gang the Red Dust Riders now." Sarah's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: disbelief, sorrow, and a deep, aching pain that mirrored his own. Why Cole? Why would he do this? To the Abernathys. He used to work there as a boy. "Because he's not that boy anymore, Sarah," Cole said, his voice harder than he intended. "The world took that boy and twisted him into something else." "And what did it turn you into?" she asked, her question sharp but not unkind. "A man who hunts his own brother." "I'm a man who upholds the law." "He is your twin," she insisted, stepping closer. Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "There has to be a part of him that remembers. The boy who saved that foal from the flash flood. The one who gave me his own jacket in a snowstorm. He's still in there, Cole. You can't just meet him with guns." Her plea was a knife in his heart because it was the same hope he was trying so desperately to kill in himself. The hope that the Luke he knew was not gone forever. But the evidence: a dead guard, a burning barn, a town gripped by fear otherwise. "Hope is a luxury I can't afford right now, Sarah," he said quietly. "He's declared war on this place. On me. What would you have me do? Let him burn it all to the ground in the hope that he remembers a foal he saved 20 years ago." Tears welled in her eyes. "I would have you remember that you are brothers. That blood runs deeper than law." "That's what I'm afraid of," Cole admitted, turning his gaze back toward the main street. He saw the faces of the townsfolk watching him from storefronts and windows. They weren't looking at Cole McGraw, their friend and neighbor. They were looking at Sheriff McGraw, the man who was supposed to stand between them, and the outlaw who wore his face. The pressure was building. Sarah was pleading for the brother, the town was demanding the sheriff, and somewhere out in the plains, Luke was waiting for his next move, forcing Cole to choose which man he was going to be. 2 days after the ranch raid, Luke McGraw made his next move. It wasn't with fire or bullets, but with a chilling display of arrogance. A lone rider, flying a white flag of truce, trotted down the main street of Dry Creek and stopped directly in front of the sheriff's office. He was a young man with a cocky grin, and he carried a message from his leader. Cole met him on the boardwalk, his hand resting near the butt of his Colt. "My name's Billy," the rider said, not bothering to dismount. "I ride for Luke McGraw. He sends his respects to his brother, the sheriff. And he sends an offer to the town council." The offer was as simple as it was audacious. Luke and his Red Dust Riders needed supplies for salt, coffee, ammunition, and medical provisions. A lot of them. He was prepared to pay for it all, in gold, at twice the going rate. In exchange for their business, he would guarantee that the town of Dry Creek itself would remain untouched. His war, the message implied, was with the wealthy ranchers and the stage lines, not the common folk. It was a devil's bargain, and it split the town in two. Cole called an emergency meeting of the town council in the back room of the saloon. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fear. The council consisted of 5 men: Silas Harrison, the pragmatic and wealthy owner of the bank; Jebediah Stone, representing the law; 2 ranchers whose lands bordered the Abernethy property; and the owner of the general store, a nervous man named Miller. "It's extortion, plain and simple," Cole stated, standing before them. "He's asking us to fund his war. If we agree to this, we become his partners. We become accomplices to every robbery and every killing." Silas Harrison, a man whose morality was often measured in profit and loss, steepled his fingers. "Let us be practical, Sheriff. He is not asking us to join him. He is offering a business proposition. He pays in gold that would be a godsend for this town, and in return, he leaves us alone. Refuse him, and what do you think happens next? He just saw fit to burn down the Abernethy barn for sport. What do you think he'll do to us for an insult? We'd be buying our safety with dirty money," Cole argued, his voice rising. "We'd be telling him that our principles are for sale." "Principles don't stop bullets, Cole," one of the ranchers shot back. "My family lives on the edge of town. It's easy for you to talk about principles from behind a badge and a gun. I'd rather be a rich accomplice than a dead hero." Miller, the store owner, wrung his hands. "He wants to buy nearly my entire stock. I could bring in more goods for everyone with that kind of money. We've been scraping by since the last drought." The debate raged for an hour. Cole found himself standing almost alone. Even Jeb, though loyal, had a worried look in his eyes. He understood the logic of the council. They were scared, and Luke was offering them an easy way out. Cole saw it not as a path to safety, but as the first step into a cage. "Think about what you're doing," Cole said, his voice low and intense as he made his final plea. "Today, it's supplies. What is it tomorrow? He'll want a place for his men to drink, a place to gamble, a place to bring his stolen goods. Once you open the door to a man like Luke McGraw, you can never fully close it again. He won't be a customer, he'll be the owner. This won't be Dry Creek anymore. It'll be his town." He looked from face to face. He saw fear, greed, and weary pragmatism. He saw men willing to trade their soul for a quiet life. Finally, Silas Harrison called for a vote. All those in favor of accepting Mr. McGraw's generous offer. Harrison's hand went up. Miller's hand went up. The 2 ranchers, after a moment of hesitation, raised theirs as well. It was 4-1. Cole felt a cold fury, not just at his brother, but at the weakness of the men he was trying to protect. "The council has decided, Sheriff," Harrison said, a note of triumph in his voice. "You will inform the writer that his offer is accepted. We will do business with Mr. McGraw." Cole stood there for a long moment, the silver star on his chest feeling like a worthless piece of tin. He had just lost his first battle for Dry Creek, and he hadn't even had to draw his gun. He walked out of the saloon and into the harsh sunlight. The writer, Billy, was still waiting, that same arrogant smirk on his face. "The council accepts," Cole said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Billy's smirk widened. "Luke figured they would. He said to tell you blood is thicker than law, brother." He wheeled his horse around and galloped out of town, leaving Cole standing alone in the street. The town had made its choice. They had paid the devil his due. And Cole knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the devil would be back to collect. The deal was done. For a week, and an easy, almost surreal peace settled over Dry Creek. Wagons loaded with supplies left Miller's general store and headed south, returning with chests of gold dust and coins that made Silas Harrison's eyes gleam. The town was prosperous, but the prosperity felt like a fever. People walked with their eyes down, conversations were held in hushed tones, and the laughter in the saloons sounded forced and hollow. They had sold a piece of themselves, and the guilt hung in the air. Cole felt like a stranger in his own town. He was the sheriff, but the council had undermined his authority, choosing the Outlaws' gold over his law. He performed his duties, but a cold distance grew between him and the townsfolk he had sworn to protect. He knew this peace was an illusion. Luke was not a man to be satisfied with a simple transaction. He was testing them, pulling them into his orbit. The other shoe was bound to drop. It dropped at the end of the week. It started subtly. The water level in the creek that gave the town its name began to fall. At first, people blamed the dry heat, but by the third day, the steady flow had slowed to a muddy trickle. By the fourth, the creek bed was a cracked, dry wound in the earth. The town's lifeblood was gone. Panic, real and primal, began to set in. Water barrels ran low. Cattle bellowed with thirst. Tempers frayed. Cole didn't need a writer to tell him what had happened. He knew this land as well as his brother did. 10 miles upstream, the creek flowed through a narrow gorge known as Serpent's Maw. It was the perfect place to build a dam. It was a strategic move, a silent act of war that was more effective than a dozen guns. Luke was reminding them who was truly in control. He had given them gold, and now he was taking their water. "He's got us in a stranglehold," Jeb said, standing beside Cole on the dry bank of the creek. "We can't survive a week without this water." The town council, so confident a week ago, was now a group of terrified, bickering men. They looked to Cole, the man they had ignored, to save them. "You have to do something, Sheriff," Miller pleaded, his face pale with sweat. "I intend to," Cole said, his voice cold. "I'm riding out to break that dam. I need a posse of 10 men. Men who can ride and shoot." There was no talk of business propositions now. The ranchers, their herds dying of thirst, volunteered immediately. Others, seeing the desperation, joined in. Within an hour, a grim-faced posse of 12 men rode out of Dry Creek, following the Dry Creek bed upstream. The heat was oppressive. The silence of the plains was broken only by the clop of hooves and the creak of leather. They rode with a sense of grim purpose. This wasn't a mission of law enforcement, it was a mission of survival. They found the dam at Serpent's Maw. It was a crude but effective piece of engineering, a wall of felled trees, rocks, and packed mud that had turned the flowing creek into a stagnant, growing lake. On the ridge overlooking the gorge, they saw them, 2 of Luke's men, silhouetted against the sky, rifles in hand. They were lookouts. "They're not going to let us just tear it down," Jeb muttered, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Cole surveyed the terrain. A frontal assault would be suicide. "We split up," he commanded. "Jeb, you take 5 men and circle around to the east. Get above them. The rest of you, with me. We'll draw their fire. When you hear us engage, you open up from the ridge. We'll have them in a crossfire." The plan worked. Cole and his group rode into the open, and the lookouts immediately opened fire, their shots echoing through the gorge. The posse dove for cover, returning fire to keep the lookouts pinned down. A few minutes later, a volley of shots erupted from the ridge behind the lookouts. Caught by surprise, one of the outlaws went down. The other, seeing he was trapped, abandoned his post and scrambled down the far side of the ridge. The skirmish was over in less than 5 minutes. The posse set to work with axes and dynamite, attacking the makeshift dam. As they worked, Cole climbed the ridge to get a better vantage point. He scanned the opposite side of the gorge, looking for any sign of the escaped rider. And then he saw him. About half a mile away, on a high bluff, sat a lone horseman. He was too far away to make out his features clearly, but Cole didn't need to. He knew the way the man sat in his saddle. He knew the shape of his shoulders. It was Luke. He had been watching the whole time. Cole raised his rifle, the stock settling into the familiar comfort of his shoulder. He sighted down the long barrel, and through the iron sights, his brother's distant form came into sharp focus. He was in range. It was a difficult shot, but a possible one. One squeeze of the trigger, and it could all be over. The threat to Dry Creek. The painful history. The man who was both his blood and his enemy. His finger tightened on the trigger. As if sensing his brother's aim, Luke turned his head. Even from that distance, Cole felt the weight of his gaze. For a long, silent moment, the 2 brothers were connected only by the deadly line of sight of a rifle. No shots were fired. No words were exchanged. It was a conversation held in pure, cold intent. Cole saw defiance in his brother's posture. He saw an unyielding will that matched his own. He saw the boy he had grown up with. With a curse, Cole lowered the rifle. He could not do it. He was a lawman, not an assassin. He would not shoot his brother in the back from half a mile away. Down below, a cheer went up from the posse as the dam finally broke. A torrent of brown water surged through the gap, rushing down the gorge towards the thirsty town. On the distant bluff, Luke watched for another moment. Then, he slowly raised a hand, not in surrender, but in a gesture that might have been a wave, or a salute, or a farewell. He turned his horse and disappeared over the ridge. Cole stood there, the rifle heavy in his hands, watching the empty space where his brother had been. He had won the battle for the water, but the look in his brother's eyes told him that the war was far from over. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that the next time they met, it would be much, much closer. The return of the water brought a wave of relief to Dry Creek, but it was short-lived. The confrontation at the dam had changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer a cold war of threats and business deals. Cole had led a posse against Luke's men. A shot had been fired in anger. The unspoken truce was broken. The town, having once welcomed Luke's gold, now huddled in fear of his retribution. Cole used the newfound unity to his advantage. He deputized 10 men from the posse, forming a town militia. They set up patrols and established a watch in the church bell tower. Dry Creek was no longer a soft target. It was a town preparing for a siege. Cole felt a grim satisfaction in this. The fear, alas, was forging the community into something stronger. The retaliation came, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't a direct assault led by Luke. It was something more chaotic, and far more senseless. While Cole was organizing the town's defense, drilling the new deputies in the street, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was a group of about 6 riders, approaching fast. They weren't the main body of the Red Dust Riders. This group was riding ragged, spurred by whiskey and aggression. Cole recognized their leader instantly, a man with a cruel, snake-like face and 2 holsters tied low on his hips. This was Rattler Keene, Luke's second in command, a man known for his volatile temper and a love for violence that even other outlaws found unsettling. "They're not flying a white flag this time," Jebediah muttered, chambering around into his rifle. Cole held up a hand, signaling for the militia to hold their fire. "Stay calm. Let's see what they want." Keene and his men thundered into town and ran their horses to a halt in a spray of dirt in front of the saloon. They were drunk, their eyes wild and bloodshot. "We come for a drink," Keene bellowed, his voice a gravelly sneer. "Our money's good here, ain't it? The sheriff's brother and this town are partners, after all." He was goading them, mocking the town for the deal they had made. Cole walked forward, his deputies fanning out behind him. "The saloon's open for paying customers, Keene," Cole said, his voice even. "But you and your men will check your guns with me first. That's the law in this town." Keene laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The law? We're friends with the law in this town. We paid for the privilege." He swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling with menace. "I'm keeping my guns. And I'm drinking on the house." He pushed past Cole and shouldered his way through the saloon doors. His men followed, laughing and swaggering. Cole knew this was a fuse being lit. He could force the issue, start a gunfight in the middle of the street, or he could let them go, hoping they would drink their fill and leave. He chose the latter, a calculated risk to avoid bloodshed. It was a choice he would regret for the rest of his life. For an hour, the saloon was filled with the sounds of raucous shouting and breaking glass. Then, a single gunshot rang out, followed by a woman's scream. Cole and his men stormed the saloon. The place was a wreck. Keene was holding one of the saloon girls, his pistol pressed to her head. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay Daniel, the town blacksmith. He was a quiet, gentle giant of a man who had only come in for a peaceful beer after a long day's work. He had apparently tried to intervene when Keene got rough with the girl. "Drop it, Keene," Cole yelled, his Colt snapping up, the hammer cocked. Keene just smiled, his eyes glittering with drunken madness. "Or what, Sheriff? You'll shoot me. You'll shoot your brother's right-hand man. Think of the trouble that'll cause." He shoved the girl away and fired a wild shot into the ceiling, using the moment of confusion to back out of the saloon. His men provided covering fire, and in a chaotic scramble of panicked townsfolk and splintering wood, the outlaws mounted their horses and galloped out of town, leaving a dead man and a shattered piece behind them. Cole knelt beside the blacksmith's body. Daniel was a good man. He had a wife and 2 young children. He had forged the bars on the jailhouse window and the hinges on the church door. He was a part of the town's very foundation. And now he was gone, murdered for nothing. The townsfolk turned to a cold, hard rage. They gathered around the saloon, their faces grim. Silas Harrison, the banker who had argued for the deal, looked pale and sick. He approached Cole, his voice trembling. "You were right, Sheriff. We let the serpent into the garden. We have a debt of blood to pay." Cole stood up, his face set like stone. The time for caution was over. The time for hope that his brother could be reasoned with was gone. This was no longer about the law. It was about justice. Daniel the blacksmith had been a friend to both McGraw brothers when they were boys, often slipping them a piece of bread or letting them warm themselves by his forge. Luke would know who Keen had killed. "This isn't on the town," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous, for all to hear. "This is on me. I'm the one who wears the badge. And I'm the one who shares his blood. I will see this debt paid." He looked toward the south, where Keen and his men had disappeared. He knew Luke would not have ordered this. This was Keen's own brand of chaos. But it didn't matter. The blood had been spilled in his brother's name. The war for Dry Creek had just become personal. The news of the blacksmith's murder reached the Red Dust Riders' hidden camp like a foul wind. Luke McGraw received the report from a scout, and his reaction was not the satisfaction of a warlord, but the cold, quiet fury of a king whose orders had been defied. His entire strategy had been based on a simple, brutal pragmatism: intimidate the powerful, do business with the weak, but never, ever shed innocent blood without purpose. Senseless violence drew posses and federal marshals. It was bad for business. More than that, Daniel the blacksmith had been a fixture of his childhood, a memory of a kindness in a hard world. He found Rattler Keen and his men by their fire, still drunk and boasting of how they had made the town dance. Luke didn't raise his voice. He walked into the circle of firelight, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. The drunken laughter died on their lips as they saw the look in his eyes. "You rode into Dry Creek," Luke stated. It wasn't a question. Keen, still full of whiskey-fueled bravado, pushed himself to his feet. "We did. Taught him a lesson. Showed him who's really in charge." "Who did you kill?" Luke asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Just some blacksmith who tried to get in the way," Keen spat dismissively. "And nobody." Luke's hand moved in a blur. The butt of his Colt pistol crashed into the side of Keen's head, sending the bigger man stumbling to the dirt. Before Keen could recover, Luke was on him, one boot on his chest, the barrel of his pistol pressed hard under Keen's chin. His name was Daniel. Luke snarled, the cold fury finally breaking through. He had a wife and 2 kids. And he was worth 10 of you. The other men who had ridden with Keen scrambled for their guns, but Luke's loyalists, drawn by the commotion, had already formed a circle, their own weapons drawn. The camp was a tinderbox, a spark away from a civil war. "I give the orders here," Luke said, his voice low enough for only Keen to hear, but the intensity carrying to everyone. "My order was to leave the town alone. You disobeyed me. You murdered a good man. You brought the heat on all of us. For what? For a bottle of whiskey and a moment of stupid pride. You're getting soft, Luke," Keen choked out, his eyes blazing with hatred. "Making deals, playing nice. We should have burned that town to the ground the day we got here." "You're a rabid dog, Keen," Luke replied. "And there's only one way to deal with a rabid dog." He cocked the hammer of his Colt. For a tense second, the entire camp held its breath. But Luke didn't pull the trigger. Killing his second-in-command would fracture the gang completely. Instead, he slowly uncocked the pistol and stepped back. "You're done," Luke said, his voice flat with finality. He turned to the rest of the gang. "Keen no longer rides with us. Anyone who wants to follow this fool can ride out with him now. But if I ever see any of you again, I will kill you on sight." He turned and walked away, not looking back. It was a calculated gamble, a test of loyalty. Keen staggered to his feet, blood trickling from the gash on his head. He looked around at the faces of his fellow riders. He saw hesitation, fear, and calculation. The 3 men who had ridden with him into town, and 2 others who were drawn to his brand of anarchy, slowly moved to his side. It wasn't a majority, but it was a faction. A dangerous, resentful faction. Without another word, Rattler Keen and his 5 followers gathered their gear, mounted their horses, and rode out of the camp, disappearing into the darkness. Luke watched them go from the edge of the camp, the firelight casting a flicker across his troubled face. He had averted a bloodbath, but he had created something just as dangerous. He had purged the infection, but now it was loose in the wild, a rogue element with a grudge against him and a taste for chaos. And he had a brother in Dry Creek who would not distinguish between the 2 factions. To Cole, they were all Red Dust Riders. They were all his enemy. The rift had not made him stronger, it had just given him one more fire to fight. The murder of the blacksmith had galvanized Dry Creek. The town was no longer a collection of fearful individuals. It was a community united by grief and a thirst for justice. They looked to Cole, their faith in his leadership restored by the tragedy. Cole, in turn, knew he could no longer afford to be reactive. He had to force his brother's hand. He had to end this. He couldn't lead a posse into the Badlands to hunt down the entire gang. That would be suicide. He needed to draw Luke out, but not in a way that would lead to a full-scale battle in the streets of the town. He needed to isolate him. To do that, he had to think like his brother. What did Luke respect? Strength. What could Luke not resist? The challenge that played to his ego and his reputation as a master strategist. The plan he devised was simple, elegant, and deeply dangerous. He would bait a trap with the one thing outlaws could never ignore: gold. He called a meeting with Silas Harrison. The banker, still shaken by the blacksmith's death and his own role in the town's vulnerability, was eager to help. "We are going to stage a gold shipment," Cole explained, leaning over a map of the county in his office. "The bank will be moving a large payroll, a fake one, to the mining camp up at Crimson Pass. We will let it be known that it's the largest shipment to leave this town in 5 years." "How do we ensure Luke hears about it?" Harrison asked. "We use one of his own," Cole said. "There's a drunkard named Pete who spends most of his time at the saloon. I've long suspected he's an informant for the writers, picking up gossip for a few dollars. We'll make sure he overhears me and you discussing the shipment's route and schedule. He'll sing like a canary." The route was the key. Crimson Pass was a narrow, winding canyon road about a day's ride from town. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush. It was so perfect, in fact, that it would be obvious. "Luke will know it's a trap," Jebediah pointed out, studying the map. "He's too smart to walk into something this obvious." "Exactly," Cole replied, a glint in his eye. "He'll know it's a trap, and his pride won't let him ignore it. He'll think he can outsmart us. He'll plan his ambush, and we will plan our counter-ambush. But the real trap isn't the gold." Cole explained the rest of the plan. The armored stagecoach would be real, as would the armed guards. Cole himself would ride with them, but the posse, the main force of the town militia, would not be riding with the coach. They would be hidden, positioned high in the rocks a mile before the main ambush site. "Luke will send scouts ahead," Cole reasoned. "They'll see the coach, see that it looks like a light escort, and report back that the trap is amateurish. Luke will lead his main force into the canyon to hit the coach. While he's focused on that, our posse will move in behind him, sealing the canyon. We'll have him boxed in. But I don't want a massacre. The moment the canyon is sealed, I will ride forward alone, under a flag of truce. I'm going to give him one last chance to surrender. I am baiting a trap not just for the outlaw, but for the brother." It was an incredible risk. It relied on Cole's intimate understanding of his twin's tremendous arrogance, his strategic thinking, and, Cole hoped, a sliver of the man he used to be. The preparations began. The fake gold bars were cast from lead and painted. The town's sturdiest coach was reinforced. The best marksmen were chosen for the posse. And the informant, Pete, was carefully fed the information over a game of poker and a bottle of whiskey. The night before the shipment, Sarah Carter came to the sheriff's office. The lantern on Cole's desk cast long shadows, making the lines on his face seem deeper. "Is it true what they're saying?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You're riding out to face him. It's the only way, Sarah. You're going to kill him?" "It wasn't a question. I'm going to stop him," Cole corrected gently. "The choice of how it ends will be his." She stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, a stark contrast to the cold weight of the Colt on his hip. "Please, Cole. When you see him, remember the boy who carved the bird. Just for a second. Remember him." Cole looked down at her hand, then into her pleading eyes. "I've never been able to forget him, Sarah. That's the problem." The next morning, as the sun crested the horizon, the stagecoach rumbled out of Dry Creek. Cole sat beside the driver, his Winchester across his lap. He looked for all the world like a man escorting a fortune. But he knew he was really a hunter, using himself as the lure, heading toward a reunion that could only end in blood and dust. Crimson Pass was a deep scar in the earth, its red rock walls rising hundreds of feet on either side of the narrow road. It was a place made for ambushes. As the stagecoach rumbled into the canyon's mouth, the air grew still and cool. The armed guards on the coach were tense, their eyes scanning the high ridges for any sign of movement. Cole, however, was calm. His trap was set. Now, he waited for the jaws to spring. He didn't have to wait long. A single rifle shot echoed from the cliffs ahead, kicking up a spray of dirt in front of the lead horses. It was the signal. "They're here," the driver yelled. "Hold your position," Cole commanded. From the rocks ahead, a dozen riders emerged, blocking the pass. At their head was Luke, astride a powerful black stallion. He looked exactly as Cole had imagined, confident, commanding, and dangerous. At the same time, from behind them, another group of riders appeared, sealing the exit. It was a classic pincer move. Luke had sprung the trap. But as Luke raised his hand to signal the attack, a third volley of rifle fire erupted, not at the coach, but from the ridges high above Luke's men. It was Jebediah and the town militia, firing down into the canyon as planned. The Red Dust Riders were thrown into confusion, caught in a crossfire. They had been the hunters, and in an instant, they had become the hunted. The canyon was sealed. Cole had won. He raised a white handkerchief tied to his rifle barrel. "Hold your fire," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He spurred his horse forward, riding slowly into the no man's land between the coach and his brother's disorganized men. "Luke," he shouted, "it's over. You're boxed in. Surrender now, and I will see that you and your men get a fair trial." Luke stared at him from across the canyon floor, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought by his own brother. His pride was a raw, open wound. But before Luke could answer, a new, chaotic element entered the fray. From a hidden side canyon that even Cole hadn't known about, a third group of riders charged forth. It was Rattler Keene and his 5 mutineers. They weren't there to help Luke. Their guns were blazing indiscriminately, firing at the militia on the ridges and at Luke's men down below. "Luke," Keene screamed, his face contorted with hate. "You should have killed me when you had the chance. The Red Dust Riders are mine now." It was a betrayal within a betrayal. Keene wasn't trying to rob the coach. He was staging a coup, using the chaos of Cole's trap to eliminate Luke and seize control of the gang. The canyon floor erupted into a maelstrom of bullets and blood. Luke's men, caught between the militia above and Keene's mutineers beside them, were cut down. The planned, orderly surrender had turned into a 3-way massacre. In the midst of the chaos, Keene saw his main target. He wheeled his horse and charged directly at Luke, his pistol raised. Luke, distracted by the firefight, saw him too late. Cole reacted on pure instinct. The years of animosity, the badge, the laud all vanished. All he saw was his brother about to be shot in the back. He spurred his horse, closing the distance in a few frantic strides. He raised his Winchester and fired. The shot was true. Keene was thrown from his saddle, dead before he hit the ground. Luke stared, stunned, as Keene's horse galloped past him. He looked at the dead mutineer, then at Cole, who was now just a few yards away, the smoking rifle in his hand. The firefight was already dying down, Keene's few remaining men either dead or fleeing. The canyon fell silent, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the groans of the wounded. The trap had worked, but not in the way Cole had intended. He had planned for a surrender. Instead, he had gotten a bloodbath. And he had just saved the life of the men he had come to rest. In the quiet aftermath of the firefight, the canyon was a grim tableau of death. The bodies of outlaws, both Luke's loyalists and Keene's mutineers, littered the ground. Jebediah and the town militia cautiously made their way down from the ridges, their faces a mixture of relief and shock. Cole and Luke sat on their horses, facing each other in the center of the carnage. The space between them crackled with a tension thicker than the gun smoke. The roles of sheriff and outlaw, so clear just moments before, were now hopelessly blurred. "You saved my life," Luke said, his voice a low rasp. It was a statement of fact, not of gratitude. "He was aiming for your back," Cole replied, his voice equally flat. "That makes 2 of us you could have shot today, but didn't," Luke noted, his eyes hard. "Why?" Before Cole could answer, they were interrupted by the sounds of a struggle. 2 of Keene's surviving mutineers had taken cover and were now trying to fight their way out. They opened fire on the approaching militia. Without a word, a lifetime of shared instinct took over. Cole and Luke wheeled their horses in unison, taking cover on opposite sides of the wrecked stagecoach. They were back to back, Brothers in arms once more, their personal war momentarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy. The fight was short and brutal. Cole, the lawman, was methodical and precise, aiming to wound, to incapacitate. Luke, the outlaw, was a whirlwind of deadly efficiency, his shots finding their mark with a finality that chilled Cole to the bone. They moved together with an unspoken rhythm, a deadly dance they hadn't performed since they were boys fighting off bullies in a back alley. They covered each other, anticipated each other's moves, two halves of a single, lethal whole. When it was over, and the last two mutineers lay still, the uneasy truce returned, even heavier than before. They had fought together, bled together. The ghost of the bond they once shared had risen from the dust and blood of the canyon floor. Luke was wounded, a bullet having grazed his arm. Cole, seeing the blood, dismounted and approached him, tearing a strip of cloth from his own shirt. "Let me see," he said, his voice softer now. Luke flinched as Cole cleaned and bound the wound, the simple act of care, a strange and painful intimacy after years of separation. "Like old times," Luke murmured, looking at his brother's hands. "You were always the one patching me up. And you were always the one getting into the trouble that needed patching," Cole countered, a faint echo of their old banter in his tone. They stood in silence for a moment. The posse was rounding up the few wounded survivors from Luke's gang. The dead were being laid out in a row. The reality of their situation came crashing back down. "This doesn't change anything," Cole said finally, his voice hardening again as he straightened up, the sheriff once more. "Doesn't it?" Luke challenged, his eyes boring into Cole's. "We just fought on the same side, brother. You tell me what the law says about that." He looked at the dead men around them. "These were my men. My responsibility. Now they're gone. Keen is gone. It's over." "It's not over," Cole said, shaking his head. "You still have a price on your head. There's still the matter of the Abernethy Ranch, the stagecoach, the blacksmith." Luke's face darkened. "The blacksmith was Keen's doing. Not mine. But it was your name he did it under. Your flag. You can't wash that blood off your hands." The chasm between them had opened up once more. They were back where they started, trapped by the choices they had made. The temporary alliance, born of blood and instinct, had dissolved, leaving only the bitter truth of who they now were. "So what happens now, Sheriff?" Luke asked, a weary, almost broken tone in his voice. "You gonna put me in chains? Take me back to a town that wants to see me hang?" Cole looked at his brother, at the tired lines around his eyes, the wound on his arm, the ghosts of the boys they used to be. He looked at the surviving members of his posse, watching them, waiting for his command. He couldn't. Not like this. Not after what had just happened. "There's a dust storm coming," Cole said, looking at the ominous, rust-colored clouds gathering on the horizon. "It'll hit by nightfall. The hill overlooking town. The one with the lone pine tree. Meet me there when the storm hits. Just you and me. We end this, once and for all." Luke held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. He whistled for his horse, mounted with a grimace of pain, and without another word, rode away, disappearing into the growing haze. Cole let him go, knowing that their uneasy truce had only bought them a few more hours before the final, heartbreaking reckoning. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a mournful howl, carrying the grit of the plains with it. Then the sky turned a sickly, bruised orange as the leading edge of the dust storm engulfed the setting sun. By the time Cole reached the lone pine on the hill overlooking Dry Creek, the world had been reduced to a swirling vortex of red dust and screaming wind. Visibility was less than 20 feet. He was already there. Luke stood beside the twisted trunk of the old pine, a dark silhouette against the rolling dust. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding the small, carved bird. Cole dismounted and walked toward him, the wind tearing at his duster. The noise of the storm was a deafening roar, forcing them to stand close, creating a strange and final pocket of intimacy in the heart of the tempest. "I figured you'd come," Luke said, his voice strained to be heard over the gale. "I always do," Cole replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the town of Dry Creek a collection of faint, blurry lights below them, a world away. "Why did you keep it?" Cole asked, nodding toward the wooden bird in his brother's hand. "To remember," Luke said, his gaze distant. "To remember there was a time when the only thing we had was each other. Before all this," he gestured vaguely at the world around them. "What happened to us, Luke?" Cole asked, The question raw with years of unspoken pain. We were the McGraw brothers. It was us against the world. Luke let out a short, bitter laugh. You chose to live in the world, Cole. You chose to follow its rules, even when you knew they were rigged. I decided I'd rather burn it down and build my own. He looked at Cole, his eyes intense. You see law and order. I see a fence built to keep men like us out. Our father worked himself into an early grave for pennies, and the banker who owned his debt bought a new carriage. That's the law you protect. So you became him, Cole countered. You became the man who takes what he wants, no matter who gets hurt. Daniel the blacksmith didn't rig any rules against you. Pain flickered in Luke's eyes. That was a mistake. But the world is full of mistakes, isn't it? My biggest one was thinking I could control men like Keen. Yours was thinking a badge could make a difference. He tucked the bird carefully into his shirt pocket. It doesn't matter now. There's no place for me to go. I can't go back. And I can't outrun my own name. He looked down at the town, a ghost of a settlement in the storm. It's a good town. You've done well by it. He turned back to Cole, a final, sad resolution settling on his features. Blood runs deeper than law, brother. You proved that today in the canyon. But in the end, it's the choices we make that define who we really are. He drew his Colt peacemaker. He didn't raise it to fire, but held it loosely at his side. It was a signal. The conversation was over. Cole's heart felt like a stone in his chest. He drew his own weapon, the cold, familiar weight of terrible finality in his hand. This was it. The last act. Not as sheriff and outlaw, but as two brothers trapped in an impossible choice. There has to be another way, Cole pleaded, his voice cracking. There never was, Luke said softly, the ghost of a smile on his lips. It was always going to end like this. On a hill. In a storm. He raised his pistol. In the swirling red chaos, 2 shots rang out. So close together they sounded almost as one. For a moment, they both stood frozen. Then, Luke staggered back a step, a dark stain spreading across his chest. His own shot had gone wide, fired a split second after his brother's, a final, deliberate act of a man choosing his own end. He looked at Cole, his eyes not filled with anger, but with a strange, quiet peace. He collapsed to his knees, his gun falling from his hand. Cole rushed forward and caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. He cradled his brother's head in his lap as the dust storm raged around them, a lone, private pocket of grief in the heart of the tempest. The bird, Luke whispered, his breath ragged. Tell Sarah I kept it. His eyes, once so full of fire and storm, went still and empty. Cole McGraw sat there for a long time, holding the body of his twin brother while the wind howled its requiem. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. The dust settled, revealing a clean, quiet world under a sky full of stars. He carried his brother's body down the hill and back into the town he had died to protect. He was Sheriff Cole McGraw again. He had upheld the law. He had paid the debt of blood. He had saved his town. But as he walked down the silent main street, the weight of his badge had never felt so heavy, and the victory had never felt so much like defeat.